The canyon looked completely different after sunset. During the day, you could see the trails, the cliffs, the sheep moving between the rocks. At night, the same canyon became a wall of darkness, and Navajo families who knew that country well understood something outsiders often didn't. You did not treat the canyon after dark like you treated it during the day. There were places people avoided. There were sounds they didn't follow, and there were stories elders passed down without explaining every detail. One of those stories came from a Navajo grandmother who remembered seeing something moving through the canyon at night. She didn't describe it like a monster from a storybook. She described what it did, where it appeared, how it moved, and why the people who knew that canyon best never went looking for it. That is the part of the story worth examining, because when you remove the exaggeration and go back to the older Navajo accounts, the question becomes much more interesting. What were people actually encountering in those canyons after the sun went down? The first thing to understand is that this story does not begin with a monster. It begins with the canyon itself. For the Diné, the landscape is not simply empty space between towns. Mountains, rivers, animals, plants, and particular places exist within a much larger system of relationships and stories. Navajo oral traditions preserve stories connected to specific landscape, including canyons and the beings associated with them. And darkness changes the way that landscape is experienced. A canyon that looks familiar in daylight can become almost impossible to read at night. Sound travels strangely between rock walls. Something moving far below can sound close. A small animal can become a large shadow. A person standing on a distant ledge can appear and disappear with a single change in light. That matters because many traditional stories were not simply created to frighten children. Navajo elders have traditionally used stories to pass on knowledge, values, and lessons. Accounts of traditional storytelling describe elders teaching younger people through stories about animals, places, creation, travel, and the natural world. And some of the oldest recorded Diné material contains something even stranger. Stories of monsters appear directly in the traditional literature. A 1928 collection recorded by Aileen O'Brien from an elderly Navajo medicine man includes an entire section titled The Monsters Appear. It also contains stories involving giant beings, dangerous creatures, canyon landscape, and people encountering beings that did not behave like ordinary humans. One of those traditions places unusual beings directly around canyon country. In the story, the coyote looks down into a canyon and encounters the people living there. The canyon is not just scenery. It becomes part of the action, the danger, and the boundary between different kinds of beings. That old material gives us an important piece of context. When a Diné elder tells a story about something moving through a canyon, the setting itself carries meaning. So when we hear the later account of a grandmother who remembered something crossing the canyon at night, the interesting question isn't simply, was it a monster? The better question is, what did she believe she was seeing? And what had she been taught about that place before she ever saw it? Because that is where these stories become much harder to dismiss as simple campfire tales. The canyon had a history before the grandmother's story, and the people who knew that history had reasons for teaching the next generation where to go, where not to go, and when to stay away. By the time the grandmother finally described what crossed the canyon after dark, she wasn't starting a new story. She was adding another piece to an old one. The oldest written material gives us something much more useful than a modern story about a creature hiding in the dark. It gives us Diné stories in which the canyon itself becomes part of the danger. One of the important records comes from Aileen O'Brien's work with Sandoval, an elderly Diné medicine man at Mesa Verde in 1928. Sandoval spent days recounting stories about his people's traditions, and O'Brien later published the material through the Bureau of American Ethnology. Inside that collection is an entire section dealing with the appearance of monsters, and these aren't random creatures inserted into an otherwise ordinary landscape. The stories repeatedly place dangerous beings around cliffs, canyons, mountains, and isolated places. One account tells of a being called the Kicker, who stayed near a cliff and attacked people who came too close to the edge. The frightening part of the story isn't simply the creature, it's the setting. A person is moving through familiar country, approaching a dangerous place, and suddenly the landscape itself becomes a trap. Another story follows a woman who transforms into a great bear and attacks people living in a canyon. The people eventually move higher into the cliffs, seeking a place where she cannot easily reach them. Look at what those stories are doing. They are turning geography into memory. A cliff is no longer just a cliff. A canyon is no longer just a shortcut between two places. A particular route can carry a warning that survives long after the original reason for the warning has been forgotten. And that matters enormously when we return to the story of the grandmother. Because if someone grows up hearing stories in which certain places are dangerous, that knowledge becomes part of the way they read the landscape. They learn which paths are ordinary, which places require caution, which sounds should be investigated, and which sounds should be left alone. The historical record also shows that Diné traditional narratives were preserved primarily through oral transmission, with later researchers recording portions of that tradition. The 1928 O'Brien material is one example. Washington Matthews had already recorded Diné legends decades earlier, publishing Navajo legends in 1897. That means there is a much older background behind the kind of warning our story begins with. It wasn't necessary for an elder to sit someone down and explain every detail. A child could learn the rule first, don't go there. Then years later, learn the story behind the rule, and perhaps much later still, learn why the older people had been so serious about it. That is how a landscape can carry memory. The canyon remembers through the people who know its stories, and the people remember through the rules they teach their children. This is also why we have to be careful with the phrase, "What crosses the canyon?" The older Diné records do contain supernatural beings and dangerous figures, but they don't provide evidence for one specific creature that can be identified as the thing in this modern title. What they do show is something more interesting. Canyons repeatedly appear as places where the ordinary world and the dangerous world meet, and once night enters the story, the uncertainty becomes even greater. A sound comes from below. You cannot see its source. Something moves between the rocks. For a few seconds you see a shape, then it disappears. To someone unfamiliar with the country, that's just a frightening moment. To someone raised inside the traditions of that landscape, the same moment can carry an entirely different weight. They already know the stories, they already know the places, and they already know that some things are not meant to be followed. That is why the grandmother's story becomes interesting only when we stop trying to decide what she saw before hearing how she described it. Did she hear footsteps? Did she see movement? Did something cross the canyon floor? Did it appear more than once? Or did the darkness turn an ordinary animal into something much larger in her memory? Those details matter because the answer isn't hidden in the word monster, it's hidden in the behavior. And according to the story we're following, there was one particular behavior that the grandmother remembered better than anything else. Whatever crossed that canyon did not simply pass through it, it followed the same route. And once she realized that, she stopped treating the sighting as a coincidence. The story changes when the grandmother stops talking about what people were supposed to avoid and starts talking about what she had actually experienced. That distinction matters because the older Diné record is full of stories handed down through families and communities, but those stories were not all told in the same way or for the same purpose. Some were creation narratives, some explained places and beings, some carried lessons about behavior, and some were traditionally told only at particular times of the year. There is even a documented account of a Navajo family storytelling gathering in which an elderly medicine woman sat with younger generations and passed on traditional knowledge. The kind of setting in which an old story isn't simply entertainment, but something being deliberately carried forward. That is the atmosphere surrounding the grandmother's account. She had grown up with stories about the country around her. She knew which places had names, she knew which places had histories, and she knew that some things were not discussed casually. Then someone asked her about the canyon. Not about monsters, not about spirits, just the simplest question. What did you see there? Her answer focused on movement. Something would appear after dark, moving through the canyon rather than across the open ground. It wasn't running. It wasn't behaving like an animal trying to escape. It seemed to be moving with a purpose. That detail is important because the older Diné stories also repeatedly give dangerous beings a particular relationship with place. They don't simply wander through an undefined wilderness. They occupy specific mountains, cliffs, caves, canyons, and paths. In O'Brien's recorded material, for example, the kicker is associated with a cliff, while other dangerous beings are connected with particular landscapes and settlements. The geography gives the story its boundaries, and that's exactly what makes the grandmother's description interesting. She wasn't saying, something is everywhere. She was describing something associated with one particular route through the canyon, the same route, the same darkness, the same general direction. That is the kind of detail a person remembers when an experience has happened more than once. And once you start thinking about what could actually move through a canyon at night, the possibilities become much less simple. A mountain lion can disappear almost completely against rock. A deer can move silently through terrain that would stop a person. A person carrying a light can appear and disappear behind walls of stone. Even sound can become deceptive. A canyon can throw an animal's call from one wall to another until the listener cannot tell where it began. But the grandmother had grown up in that environment. She would have known the ordinary sounds. She would have known the animals. She would have known what a person moving through the canyon sounded like. So when she described something she couldn't place, the mystery wasn't simply that she had seen a strange shape. It was that the shape did something she couldn't reconcile with the ordinary things she already knew. And that is where the old stories become relevant again. The Diné oral tradition contains stories of beings that were dangerous precisely because they violated the normal boundaries of the world. The monsters weren't merely large animals. They had intentions. They had territories. They interacted with people. And people had to learn how to survive in a world where the familiar landscape could contain something unexpected. The grandmother's story carried that same tension. She never needed to give the thing a dramatic name. She didn't need to describe glowing eyes or impossible powers. What frightened her was simpler. She knew the canyon, and whatever she had seen there didn't behave the way she expected something in that canyon to behave. That was why the warning survived. Not because everyone had seen the same thing, but because she had seen enough to stop treating the canyon after dark as an ordinary place. And then, near the end of her life, she gave one final detail. She said the movement always disappeared at the same place. Not at the end of the canyon, not beyond the cliffs, at a particular section of rock where the trail narrowed and the canyon walls closed together. She had never followed it beyond that point. And according to her, neither should anyone else. That was the part of her story that stayed with the family, because she wasn't telling them to believe in a monster. She was telling them not to make the mistake she had already made, going close enough to find out what was there. The strange thing about the grandmother's story is that it never really needed a name. She didn't need to call what she saw a monster. She didn't need to give it some dramatic identity. What mattered was the warning that remained after the sighting. Because in Diné tradition, stories about dangerous beings are much older than any modern account of something moving through a canyon at night. Traditional sources recorded by Aileen O'Brien include an entire section called The Monsters Appear, with stories of beings such as the kicking monster, the giant, and other figures that made the world dangerous for the people. And those stories weren't simply about frightening creatures. They were part of a larger cultural world in which people learned how to understand danger, place, behavior, and the relationship between human beings and the landscape. That is why the grandmother's final warning matters more than the creature itself. She had spent years knowing that canyon. She knew the difference between ordinary movement and something she couldn't explain. She knew where the trails narrowed. She knew where the cliffs swallowed sound. And she knew the section of the canyon where she had seen the movement disappear. She never followed it. That decision may be the most important detail in the entire story, because once you reach the end of an old account like this, there is always a temptation to invent the missing piece, to give the shadow a name, to turn a distant movement into a giant, to take an old cultural tradition and attach a modern monster to it. But the older Diné record gives us something much more substantial than that. It shows that stories of dangerous beings were already deeply embedded in Navajo tradition, long before modern internet mystery stories existed. Washington Matthews was recording Diné oral traditions as early as the 19th century. His Navajo legends, first published in 1897, became one of the earliest major English language collections of Navajo oral traditions, and decades later, O'Brien recorded another substantial body of traditional material from Sandoval in 1928. The material was eventually published by the Bureau of American Ethnology in 1956. That gives us a remarkable historical trail. Stories told by elders, stories recorded by outsiders, stories carried through generations, and stories in which the landscape is never incidental. The canyon, the cliff, the mountain, the trail, these places matter because the stories have happened there. So when the grandmother says something crosses the canyon after dark, the real mystery isn't whether we can prove a creature was physically walking through the darkness. We can't. There is no independent record that allows us to identify the thing she saw. What we can establish is that the larger cultural background is real. Diné traditions contain long-standing accounts of monsters and dangerous beings. Diné storytelling has preserved knowledge through elders and generations, and historical collectors such as Washington Matthews and Aileen O'Brien documented substantial portions of that tradition. That changes the way we should hear the grandmother's warning. Maybe she saw an animal. Maybe she saw a person moving through the canyon. Maybe darkness and distance transformed something ordinary into something impossible to recognize. Or perhaps she experienced something she genuinely could never explain. But the important part is that she didn't need everyone else to agree with her. She had already made her decision. Stay away from that section after dark. And that is exactly how an old warning survives. Not because every generation sees the same thing, because one generation tells the next. I went there. I saw something. Don't make the same mistake. There is also a deeper lesson here. The surviving Diné record reminds us that traditional stories shouldn't be stripped from their cultural setting and turned into simple monster stories. The Navajo Nation's own cultural materials describe the Naye, the monsters, as part of an older account of danger, disorder, and harm to the people. So perhaps the most honest ending is not to tell you that we have discovered what crossed that canyon. We haven't. The evidence doesn't give us that. What it gives us is something more interesting, a landscape with a long memory, a tradition in which dangerous beings have been spoken about for generations, historical records showing that these stories were being preserved long before today's mystery channels existed, and a grandmother who, according to the story, spent most of her life refusing to explain what she had seen. Then finally, she spoke, not to prove anything, not to frighten anyone, just to pass on the warning. Whatever she saw in that canyon, she never went looking for it again. And perhaps that is why the story survived. Because sometimes the oldest stories aren't preserved because someone found the answer. They're preserved because someone knew enough to say, don't go there after dark.